black dog went into the water at dusk on the last evening of January, the way he had gone in every dusk for 2 winters, walking down the shelving stones of the boat slip without a sound and swimming straight out across the flat dark mere toward the little island in the middle, where nothing grew but 3 bent alders. And he stood there in the shallows off the island with the water round his chest and his head up and his eyes on the black surface, waiting for a man to come up out of it who was never going to come up again. And there was not a living soul on that estate who could call him back. Old Caleb Stroud stood on the slip in his oilskin with a lantern he had not lit and watched the dog go, as he had watched him go 600 nights, and he did not call, because he had learned that calling did no good, and that a man's voice carried out over that water in the cold and came back to him thin and useless and made the whole thing worse. Behind him the great gray house of Ravensmere stood up against the last green light in the west, with every window along its front gone dark but 2. And the frost was coming down already, so that the reeds at the water's edge were furring white while he watched. And out on the mere the black dog swam his slow circle round the island and would not come in. And the bell in the little boathouse that nobody had rung in 2 years hung still in its frame, with a skin of ice on the rope. 6 months from that evening, the Duke of Ravensmere would walk down to that same slip in front of the whole of 2 parishes and put his hand into the cold and call that dog in by a name he had not been able to say aloud since the ice broke. And the dog would come to him through the water like something being given back. But on the last evening of January, the Duke was a shut window and a dark house, and a man nobody had heard speak above a murmur in 2 years. And the woman who was going to open him had not yet come up the drive. Her name was Thomasin Bligh, and she was 24 years old, and she was, that evening, some 11 miles off, sitting on a carrier's cart with a small leather box on her knees and her father's dead coat buttoned to her chin against a cold that got into the bone and stayed, and she did not yet know the name of the water she was going to give the rest of her life to. She had been until the autumn the daughter of a country parson, the Reverend Silas Bligh, who had held the living of a poor drowned parish down on the levels where the river went wide and slow and took a life most winters, 1 careless boy or 1 drunk man or 1 horse and cart gone off the ford in the dark, and her father had been the man they came for when it happened, at any hour, in any weather, because he was not afraid of the water, and he was not afraid of the dead, and he had taught his motherless daughter both of those things at his knee before she was 10 years old. She had helped him bring them in. Everything she could do afterward at Ravensmere came out of that. She had stood beside her father on a black riverbank with a lantern, while the men brought a drowned neighbor up out of the reeds, and had learned from him the thing he believed above all his articles of faith, that the drowned are not to be feared and not to be hidden and not to be lied about, but named and grieved and let go, and that a grief you will not say the name of does not stay buried, but comes up again. The way a thing weighted badly comes up off the bottom of a slow river and floats. He died in the 2nd week of October, in his own study, over a sermon he never finished, of a quiet failure of the heart he had told nobody about. And Thomasin found him in the morning, with his pen still in his fingers and the fire gone cold. And she sat with him until it was light because she was not afraid. And then she went and rang the bell herself and told the sexton, in the flat, steady voice her father had taught her to use for the worst news, that the parson was dead. The living was in the gift of a patron who had a nephew wanting a place, and the nephew wanted the parsonage with it. And Thomasin Bligh was given until Lady Day to be gone out of the only house she had ever lived in. and when the debts were reckoned, there was a great deal less than nothing. Because a parson in a poor parish spends what he has on the parish and dies owing the tradesman. And she sold what could be sold, the books and the good clock and her mother's little garnet brooch, and she paid what could be paid, and at the end of it she had £3, a change of linen, her father's coat, and no living relation nearer than a cousin in the wool trade at Norwich, who wrote her a careful letter about how times were very hard in the wool trade. It was the bishop's chaplain, a kind harassed man who had liked her father, who found her the place. There was a great house in the north of the county, he wrote, the seat of the Duke of Ravensmere, where the Dowager Duchess, an old lady much afflicted in her sight and her spirits, wanted a gentlewoman to read to her and keep her company and manage her correspondence, and the family were retired and particular, and the wage was small, £30 by the year. But the position was a respectable one and safe, and he had taken the liberty of putting her name forward, and she might have it if she chose. She chose it. She had, at that point, £3 and a coat, and no other door in the world standing open, and she wrote and accepted and packed her box. And on the last day of January she went north on the carrier's cart in a hard black frost, 11 miles up out of the levels into a country she had never seen, a high cold country of grey stone walls and bare fells and standing water. And the carrier, who was a talker, gave her the whole of Ravensmere before she had seen its chimneys. He told her the Duke was a young man still, 32 and unmarried, and that he had been a pleasant enough gentleman once before it happened, and that he now went about his own land like a man walking through a house where somebody lies very ill, quiet, careful, saying nothing. He told her there had been a brother. He got that far, and then he did a thing she was to see a great many people do in the months to come. He stopped and looked hard at the frozen hedge, and clicked his tongue at the horse, and changed the subject to the badness of the roads, and Thomason Bligh learned the first law of Ravensmere from a man who did not even work there, and had never been past its gates, which was that there had been a brother, and that the brother was not to be spoken of. Nobody said what had happened. All the way up the last miles, at the toll and the smithy and the one poor inn where the cart stopped to water, she heard it the same way. In the shape of the hole it left, they said before it, and they said since it, and they said the young lord, poor soul, and looked away, and built their sentences round the middle of the thing, and stepped over the gap so smoothly that you saw they had been doing it for 2 years, and had stopped noticing they did it at all. The gates of Ravensmere stood open when the cart came to them at the very end of the light. Tall iron gates hung between 2 squat stone piers, and there was a boat carved on the top of each pier, a little stone rowing boat with an oar shipped, which she thought a strange thing to set over a gate until she understood, later, that the family had made its first money 300 years before out of the water trade on the mere and the river below it, and had put boats on everything, on the gates and the plate and the very tombs, in the days when the water was their friend. The drive went up for the better part of a mile between bare black limes, and then the house, and she had braced herself to be afraid of it, and she was not. It was very large and very old, and beautifully made of a grey stone gone nearly black with the wet of that country, and it stood on a shelf of ground above a great sheet of still water that lay below it silver and flat in the last light, with an island in the middle of it. And every window along the front of the house was dark. And it looked to her, at that first sight in the cold, less like a proud man, and more like a man sitting up all night in a chair beside a bed, waiting, not moving, in the dark, for something that was not going to change. The cart set her down at the side, under an arch, and rattled off into the dark, and she stood with her box at her feet in a cold that made the inside of her nose ache. And nobody came for her for a long quarter of an hour, and she spent the quarter of an hour listening, because her father had taught her that too, that a place tells you what it is before a person does if you will only hold still and let it. And Ravensmere, in the frost, in the dark, was as silent as a held breath. And then, from away down the slope, from the black water she could just see between the buildings, there came a sound she knew, and it stopped her heart in her chest and set it going again wrong. It was the sound of an animal in the water, not being bathed, not swimming for pleasure or for game, but swimming slow and steady and endless in the cold, out and round and back, the small tireless wash of a strong dog holding himself off a shore he would not leave, and under it once, thin across the water, the sound the dog made, which was not a bark and not a howl, but something worse than either. A low, broken, questioning sound thrown out over the surface and getting no answer. And Thomasin Bligh stood in the frozen arch with her box at her feet and her father's coat round her, and understood, before she had met one soul in that house, that she had come to a place where a grief had gone down into the water and had not been let up, and that somewhere down there in the dark a creature was doing what her father had spent his life telling people not to do, which was to wait at the edge of the deep for someone to come back who could not, and she did not yet know whose dog it was, or whose water, or whose name it was that could not be said. But she stood and listened to him swim, and something in her that had helped her father bring the drowned up out of the Black River for 20 years turned over and woke, and she thought, before she could stop herself, before she had any right to the thought at all, somebody has got to go down there and tell that dog. When a woman finally came out to her with a horn lantern, it was the housekeeper, Mrs. Trewin, a spare, upright woman of 60 with a face like the flat of a spade, and she held the lantern up to Thomasin's face and looked at her, and looked at the small box and said, "Well, there is not a great deal of you, is there?" in a tone that settled the entire matter of Thomasin Bligh for the household before Thomasin had said a word. The box went up a back stair and along a passage colder than the yard to a room at the north end, where the water in the ewer would wear a lid of ice by morning, and the one small window looked out, she found in the daylight, over the roofs of the boat-houses and down onto the head of the mere. Mrs. Trewin went through the rules on the stairs the way a woman reads out a bill she does not expect to be questioned on. Prayers at 7:30, the old Duchess at 9, in the morning room for reading, and again after her dinner, and Thomasin was to read what she was given and not what she thought fit, and to write the letters the old lady dictated and to burn the ones she was told to burn. She was not to go into the west wing, which was shut, nor up the river gallery to the far door, which was locked, and the key not hers to ask after. She was not, on any account, to go down to the water, and most particularly not past the last boat-house to the slip at the head of the mere, and she was not to speak of the water or ask of it. And if she heard anything in the night from that direction, she was to shut her window and say nothing in the morning. She was not to discuss the family with the servants, nor the servants with the family, nor anything at all with anybody in the village. And then, on the half-landing, with her hand flat on the newel, Mrs. Trewin stopped, and said the last of it in a lower voice, the worn, smooth voice of a thing repeated until it has no edges left. "In this house we do not speak of the young lord." Thomasin waited for the rest of it, for the name, for the how and the when, and there was no rest of it. Mrs. Trewin lifted her lantern and went on up the stairs. The old Duchess, when Thomasin was taken to her the next morning, was a very small, very old woman sitting bolt upright by a great fire, with a lace cap and clouded eyes gone nearly white that could tell light from dark and little else, and hands that never stopped moving in her lap, turning and turning a child's ivory whistle on a cord, worn yellow with handling. She felt Thomason's face all over, quick and shameless as the blind are, and said, in a dry voice with the whole authority of 80 years in it, "You have buried somebody." Thomason said, "My father, my lady, in October." And the old Duchess said, "I can feel it in the bone of you. They carry it in the jaw. Sit down and read to me, and do not be one of the ones who cries. I have had 3 of you, and 2 of them cried, and I sent them away. The dead do not want your water." And Thomason, who had not cried at her own father's graveside, said, "No, my lady, I am not one of the ones who cries," and read to her in her flat, steady voice until the restless hands went still and understood that she had, for the first time in that house, been of use. She learned the shape of Ravensmere the way the furniture learns a house, from underneath and by the cold, and everywhere she went in it she found the grief laid out through the rooms like a table set for a guest who was never going to come. She found the young lord's gun-room kept swept and aired, and a pair of his tall boots by the door with the mud of some last day dried on under the polish, cleaned round but never cleaned off, because to scrape the last mud from a dead man's boots was a thing nobody in that house had been able to order done. And on the river gallery she found the locked door she was forbidden, and outside it, on a marble table, a man's hat and gloves and a newspaper 2 years old, laid ready as if their owner would be out directly to take them up. She found the portraits, 2 young men painted as boys with the mirror behind, so alike about the eyes that she had to be told which was which, the elder grave with his hand on the younger's shoulder, the younger laughing, half out of the frame already, caught turning to run down to the water that was going to keep him. And she found the child. The child was called Bee, which was short for Beatrice, and she was 5 years old, and she was the young lord's daughter, and she was an orphan twice over. Her mother dead of a fever the year before her father drowned, so that when the mere took him, it took the last she had, and she lived at the top of the house with a nurse who was too old for her, and a cold that no fire seemed to reach. And she did not, Thomason was told, go out of doors. She had used to, the nurse said. She had used to be down at that water, every hour God sent, on her father's shoulders and in the little boat and paddling in the shallows, a water baby, brown as a nut all summer. And since the winter it happened, she would not go past the terrace, would not go down the slope, would stand at the nursery window at dusk and look down at the mere with her face gone flat and old and careful, watching, the nurse thought, for the dog to come in, and then be got to bed. Thomason met her on the 3rd day. A small, solemn, dark-haired little girl sitting very upright at a schoolroom table with her hands folded, watching the door to see what was coming through it, and the child had her dead father's eyes out of the portrait exactly, and something in Thomason turned over again, the same thing that had turned over in the arch that first night at the sound of the dog, and she did not, then or ever, try to make the child anything she was not. She had grown up with a man who would sooner have gone hungry than hurry a frightened creature, and she knew the one law that ran under all the others, which was that you do not go and fetch a thing that has gone away inside itself. You make the place safe, and you make yourself dull, and you wait, and it comes back to the door of its own accord to see what you are about, and it cannot be hurried by so much as an hour. So she read to the child, and did the globes and the maps with her, and asked her nothing she could not answer with a nod, and let her be. She learned the man of the water before she ever went to the dog. His name was Caleb Stroud, and he was near 70, a boat keeper and a waterman, born in a cottage at the foot of the mere, and he had taught both the young gentlemen to row and to swim and to fish before either could well walk, and he was the only creature the black dog would suffer near him on the slip, though even Caleb he would not follow in. She found him one raw afternoon in the last boathouse, the one she was allowed as far as, mending a net he had no more use for, and she stood in the doorway and did not ask about the dog, and did not ask about the young lord, but asked him, as one waterside child to an old waterside man, whether the mere took a life most winters the way her father's river had. And Caleb Stroud looked up at her, at the smallness of her and the man's coat, and the flat, unfrightened way she had said the word took. And something in his old face decided to trust her with the first true sentence anyone at Ravensmere had given her. "It takes what it is let take," he said. And he told her a little. That first day, not the worst of it, only the shape. The dog was the young lord's own, reared from a pup at his heel, a water dog of the old rough black-coated northern sort that were bred to go off the boats after the nets and the wildfowl, and would swim till their hearts stopped and think it play. When the young lord went into the mere, the dog had gone in after him, in the black dark, in the ice, and had swum the whole of that night looking for him, and Caleb had stood on the slip the whole of that night calling the dog, and the dog would not come in, and they had got the dog out in the morning more dead than alive, and wrapped him in sacks by the fire, and he had lived, and every dusk since, for 2 winters, at the hour it had happened. The dog went down to the slip and put himself into the water, and swam out to the island and stood off it in the shallows waiting, and came in only when it was full dark and he was foundered with cold, to lie all night at the locked door of the young lord's rooms on the river gallery, and to be down at the slip again the next dusk. And there was not a man on the estate could break him of it, and the estate carpenter had twice fenced the slip, and the dog had twice gone through or over the fence and cut himself doing it, and now they had given over fencing it and only let him go. And Caleb Stroud, telling her this, mending a net he did not need, looked out of the boathouse door at the flat water and said, "He is waiting on a thing that is not coming, miss, and there is no worse thing on this earth to watch, and I have watched it 600 nights." Thomason said, "And nobody has told him." Caleb looked at her. "Told him what?" he said. And Thomason said, "My father held it for the truest thing he knew, that a beast will wait at the edge of the deep for its master till its own heart gives out, unless somebody it trusts goes and tells it, plainly, that the master is dead and is not coming, and it is let stop, and it sounds a mad thing to a man who has not seen it done, but I have seen it done. I have seen my father do it over a drowned man's dog on the levels, and I have seen the dog leave off and come away, and it is not madness, and it is not magic. It is only that a grieving thing cannot put a weight down that it was never let take up. And you have all of you here, for 2 years, forbidden this one to grieve, the same as you have forbidden the house. And it is the same sickness in the dog as in the door, and in the boots, and in the child at the window, and it is all of it one thing." Caleb Stroud sat with the net in his hands and looked at her for a long time, and then he said very low, "We are none of us let, miss. That is the whole of it, and you have said it in a breath. We are none of us let." That evening, before the light was quite gone, Thomason stood at the small window of her cold north room, which she was not supposed to do, and watched the thing the house was built round, though she did not yet know that that was what she was seeing. Down at the head of the mere, small and far below, a black shape came out from among the boathouses onto the pale stones of the slip, and stood a moment with its head up looking at the water, and then walked down into it without a check, and struck out, low and steady, across the flat, cold surface toward the black island, and Caleb Stroud's small, stooped figure came out onto the slip behind it with an unlit lantern and stood, and did not call, and the dog swam his slow circle off the island and would not come in. And the light went out of the sky by degrees, until she could see neither of them, only the last of the water, and here, thin and far, coming up the frozen slope to her window, the small tireless wash of a strong animal holding itself off ashore in the dark, and once that broken questioning cry thrown out over the deep and getting no answer. And up in the north room, Thomas and Bly sat down on the edge of the hard cold bed with her father's coat still round her shoulders, and thought of the last drowned man she and her father had brought in, a ferryman off the levels the winter before her father died, and of how her father had knelt on the black bank in the rain and told the man's old dog, in the same flat voice he used for reckoning a bill, "Thy master is dead, and is drowned, and is not coming over, and thou art to come away home now and not wait," and of how the dog had whined and turned 3 times, and come away up the bank to heal, and grieved, and lived, and she sat in a duke's freezing house and listened, far below her, to a dog that nobody in 2 years had had the courage to tell one true word, swimming and turning and swimming, in the dark. And she made up her mind, sitting there, that she was going to do the one useful thing she knew how to do in all the world, whatever it cost her, and that she was going to begin it that week. She went down to the water on the 9th night. She could not hold off any longer. She waited until the house was down and the last light gone from under the last door, and went out in her father's coat with a lantern turned as low as it would go, down the frozen slope past the boathouses to the slip. And she did not go on to the slip, because a strange foot on his stones in the dark was the surest way to send the dog off the far end of the world, but stopped well back at the corner of the last boathouse, set the lantern behind her, where its light would not fall on the water, and did the thing her father had taught her to do with a creature gone dangerous with grief, which was to do nothing at all. For a very long time she did not call. She did not whistle or cluck or coax. She stood with her shoulder against the cold boards, and her face turned a little away from the water, because a frightened thing reads a straight look as a threat, and she breathed slow and long and audible in the still air, and let the dog, out there in the dark, hear that there was a person on the shore who was not calling him and not coming after him and not wanting one single thing from him. And she waited. The small, tireless wash of him out by the island went on a while, and then it stopped. That was the first thing, and it went through her like cold water, the stopping, the silence where the swimming had been, and then she heard him coming in, the wash changing, coming nearer and slower. And she made herself not turn her head, and she heard him come up out of the mere onto the stones, the long streaming shake of him, and then his feet on the slip, coming up, and then nothing. And she knew he was standing a few feet off in the dark, with the water running off him, looking at her, taking the whole of her in, the man's coat and the smell of the sick room and the cold. And she stood with her eyes turned away and her breath going slow and even, and did not move so much as a finger. And after a long while, out of the dark at the level of her hip, there came one long suspicious pull of breath as the dog smelled her over from her hem to her hand, and then, very slowly, the cold wet weight of a great head came to rest against the side of her knee, and stayed there, and she heard the animal let go a breath, a long, uneven, shuddering sigh of a breath, the breath of a creature setting down for one moment a weight it has been carrying alone too long. And she stood in the black frost with a drowned man's dog leaning the whole grief of him against her leg, and did not touch him, and did not speak, and let her own tears go down her face in the dark, where nobody could see them, and cost her nothing. She went every night after that, at the hour nobody wanted her, and gave the dog nothing but a dull, safe, steady presence, and the sound of a person breathing who asked him for nothing. And within a fortnight she had her flat hand on the great streaming shoulder, on the place her father had shown her when she was 9, where you may feel the whole engine of an animal running under your palm, and she felt the endless waiting tread of him go still under her hand. And she began, on those nights, in the flat plain voice, with her hand on the wet black shoulder, to tell him. She told him that his master had gone into the water and had not come up, and was dead, and was not down there under the island to be waited for, and was not coming over, and that he was let stop now, and let come away, and let sleep by a fire like an old dog that had done its work. And she said it the same way night after night over the water, and did not know whether a dog could take one word of it. But she knew nobody else had said it, and she remembered the ferryman's dog turning 3 times and coming away up the bank to heel, and she went on saying it. Old Caleb Stroud came down and found her at it on a wild wet night at the start of the 3rd week, standing on the slip now, right down on the stones, with the black dog sitting against her leg and her hand on his head, and her voice going low and steady out over the water. And the old man stood back among the boathouses with the rain running off his cap, and did not speak for a long time. And then he came out onto the slip and stood beside her, and he said, in a voice that had something come loose in it, I have been feared of that water for 2 year, miss. Feared to go down to it, and feared to keep away from it both. And I have loved that dog 40 times, as long as ever you have known him. And I could not do the one useful thing for him. And I have watched you do it a fortnight now from up there, and not had the courage to come down. And Thomason said, he is not mad, Caleb. He is grieving. And there is a world of difference. And every soul in this house knows the difference in a person, and not one of you will let yourselves see it in a dog, or in a horse, or in a child, or in a man. And it is the same grief in every one of them, and it is all of it forbidden. Caleb Stroud looked at the dog leaning quiet against her. This dog he had watched swim himself half to death 600 nights, and he took his wet cap off, which she never once saw him do for any living gentleman in all the time she knew him. And he said, no, he is not mad. God forgive the lot of us. The child came to the dog before she came back to the world, and it happened the way her father had always said such things happen, sideways, when nobody was reaching for it. Little B had taken, by February, to slipping down after Thomason in the safe gray hour before the household stirred. Silent, holding a fold of Thomason's coat, down as far as the terrace above the slope, where she would go no further. Standing in the cold with her flat old careful eyes on the water and the black shape of the dog upon it, and Thomason never once said come and see him, because she knew the surest way to send the child a mile back inside herself was to want a thing of her out loud. She only let her stand there, morning on morning, ignored and safe, and one gray morning at the end of February she became aware, without turning her head, that the small figure at the terrace rail was gone from it, and she went on coiling the wet line and said nothing, and looked at nothing. And out of the tail of her eye watched a very small girl come down the whole of the forbidden slope, one slow step at a time, down to the one place on that estate where a stranger would have snatched her back screaming, and stopped beside the great black dog that had swum all night after her dead father, and lay one small hand flat on his wet shoulder, on the running engine place, though nobody had shown her, because she was her father's daughter, and the dog turned his big head and breathed once over the child's dark hair, and lay down on the cold stones and put his chin over her small feet and let out that same long shuddering sigh. And the child stood inside the curl of him with her hand on his ribs and looked at the water, and Thomasin stood 4 feet off with her heart going like a hammer and said, in the idle nonsense voice she used on the dog so the child would not know she had been seen, well, now there is a good dog, and went on coiling the line, and did not spoil it. And it was the hardest work she did in all those weeks, harder than the water in the dark, to stand there and let it be true, and not break it by being glad. She met the Duke on the 2nd of March, at dusk, at the head of the slip. She had the dog out of the water early, before the light was gone, sitting quiet and dry against her knee for once instead of swimming, which was a new thing and a great thing, and she was talking to him. The low-running nonsense that means nothing and carries everything, and that water people and horse people talk to their beasts and cannot explain to anybody who is not one. And she looked up, and there was a man standing at the corner of the last boathouse watching her, and she knew him at once, though she had never once seen him near, because for 6 weeks the whole house had arranged itself around his absence, and here the absence was, wearing a black coat. He was tall, a good deal over 6 foot, and worn thin nearly to gauntness, with dark, unruly hair pushed back off a hard, handsome, unhappy face. And he was the grave, careful elder boy out of the portrait grown into a haunted man, and he was looking not at her but at the dog, at his dead brother's dog sitting dry and quiet on the slip in the last light, with an expression on his face like a man looking through a doorway into a room where somebody he loved used to sit. She should have got up and dropped her eyes and curtsied and taken the dog away, because that is what the reader of sermons to the blind old duchess does when the master of the house appears out of the dark. But she was tired, and 6 weeks into a thing that was going to break her heart or make it, and she had the dog gone soft and quiet against her at last after a fortnight's work, and she was not going to jump up and stiffen him and undo it all for the sake of a curtsy, and so she said, without turning her head, in the flat, plain Level's voice, "Keep still where you are, sir, if you please, and do not speak yet." The Duke of Ravensmere, who had not been told what to do by a living soul since he was 19, who was addressed by his own household in the passive voice, and handled by every creature in his life like a cracked glass being carried across a crowded room, kept still at the corner of the boathouse and did not speak. The dog had felt him before Thomasin had seen him, and had come up off the stones with the old start coming into him, the water-ward pull, because the man at the boathouse was part of the ice and the black night and the worst thing that had ever happened, and Thomasin put her hand flat on the dog's back and talked him down, the low nonsense, until he stopped trembling and dropped his head. And only then, with the dog quiet, did she let the lead run out long through her fingers and let the dog drift, if he chose, up the stones toward the still figure of the man, on his own feet, at his own pace, choosing it, and she did not pull him 1 inch either way. And the black dog walked up the slip to the Duke of Ravensmere and stopped a yard short of him, and put his head out and smelled the man's hand. One long, unwilling pull of air, the brother's smell that was so near the dead man's smell, and the Duke stood with his jaw set like a man taking a wound, and let himself be smelled. And then the great wet black head came the last foot and pushed, once, hard, into the man's hanging hand, the way it must have pushed 1,000 times at another hand so like it. And the Duke made a sound in his chest that was not a word, and went down on one knee on the cold stones in his good coat, and put both his arms round the neck of his dead brother's dog, and held on, And the dog stood and let himself be held. And over the man's bowed dark head the dog looked at Thomasin, and she looked away at the water, because there are things a person is owed, and one of them is not to be watched while it happens. When the Duke stood up at last, his face was wet, and he did not trouble to hide it, and he looked at her across the dog for a long moment with an expression she could not read at all. And he said, in a low voice with 2 years of rust and disuse all over it, the first words she ever heard him speak, they told me he was past saving. And Thomasin said, "They were mistaken, sir. He is not past saving. He is heartbroken. And he is a great, strong, faithful creature, so there is a great deal of it. But it is not madness, and it is not past saving. It is grief, and grief will answer to patience where it will answer to nothing else on this earth." The Duke looked down at the dog leaning against his leg. "And where," he said, very low, "did you learn that it was grief and not madness?" And Thomasin said, "At my father's knee, sir, on a riverbank, in the dark, before I could read." And the Duke of Ravensmere said, "Then your father knew more than the 3 physicians I have had to this house." And he turned and walked up the dark slope to the darker house without another word and without bidding her good night. And that was the first time. He came again, not every dusk, but often, at the hour she had the dog down on the slip. And he would stand at the corner of the boat-house with his hands pushed into his coat and watch, and sometimes he said nothing at all, and after a while went up to the house, and sometimes he asked her a plain question about the dog, and she answered it plainly. And piece by piece, over the wet weeks of March, the man began to talk. Not about it, around it. He told her the dog had been whelped the same spring his brother had his first gun, and that the 2 of them, the boy and the dog, had been one creature about the water from that summer on, in it and on it and beside it every hour of the light. He told her, one green evening at the end of the month, with the light dying long over the fell, that he had not slept a whole night through in 2 years, and then looked as though he wished he could reach into the air and pull the words back, and Thomasin said, "My father used to say that a man who cannot sleep is only somebody standing out in the cold at a door, waiting to be let in," and the Duke said, "That is not a comfortable thought," and she said, "No, sir, but it is a door." And doors open. And he was quiet a long while, and then he said, "Lo, I do not know how to open this one. I never had the way of it. My brother had the way of it, and I never did." And she did not answer that, and she did not reach for the latch of him with a lever, because you do not go and fetch a thing that has gone away inside itself. You make the place safe, and you wait. It came out of him at last on a night of hard rain in the first week of April. Not because she asked, she never once asked, but because a weight held alone too long will come off the bottom in the end, whether a man wills it or no. They were in the last boat-house out of the rain, the dog dry between them on a heap of sacking, the lantern low, the mere hissing with rain beyond the open door, and the Duke sat on an upturned boat and looked at the water and said, "Into the dark." We were on the ice. Thomasin said nothing, and kept her hand moving slow on the dog, and let him go on into the silence the way you let a frightened creature come to the door in its own time. He said, "It was the hard frost after 12th night, 2 years since, and the mere had borne for a week, and the whole vale had been down on it in the day, skating, with fires on the shore, and my brother and I stayed out after the rest were gone in, the 2 of us, the way we had done since we were boys, out in the middle by the island in the dark, with a lantern, and I heard it go. There is a sound," he said, "that ice makes before it goes, a sound like a great cord drawn tight, and I heard it under us out by the island where the spring rises and the ice is never sound, and I stood still, because I am the one who stands still. I have stood still and held the gate, and counted the cost my whole life while he went first at everything and laughed at me for minding. And I stood still and I called to him to come in off it slowly. And he laughed and said the old careful Ravensmere, and turned to come to me, and it went under him. All at once, not a crack but a whole black mouth of it opening, and he was in. The Duke stopped. The rain came down. Thomasin kept her hand moving on the dog and did not look at him. He said, I went out on my belly the way you are taught, and I had his wrist in my 2 hands, and the dog was in the water beside him, going mad, and the ice kept breaking back toward me under my own weight. And he looked up at me, and he was not afraid. He was never afraid of anything in his life, and he took his wrist out of my hands. He took it back. He shoved himself down and back into the black on purpose, because he had felt what I felt, that the ice would not bear the 2 of us going back, and he was the one who went first at everything and did the sums last, and for once he did the sum first and faster than I could, and put himself under to take his weight off the ice, so that mine would carry. And I lived, and he did not. And the dog swam the whole night looking for him, and I have not in 2 years been able to say one word of it aloud, because there is no word of it that is not I lived because he chose that I should. And how does a man stand up in the light and say that, and eat his dinner, and be the Duke? And Thomasin Bligh sat in the boathouse in the rain, with her hand on the dog, and understood the whole of it at last. And she did not say, it was not your fault, because it was not his fault, and he knew that already, and it had never once been the point. She said, after a long while, in the flat plain voice, my father drowned a man he could not reach. One winter, a boy who went off the ford, and my father had a rope and threw it short by the length of his own arm, and the boy went down. And my father held that he had thrown it short, though every man on the bank swore it could not have reached. And he carried it 11 years, and the week he died he told me the thing he had come to at the end of it, which was that the ones who are left are not left because they were worth more. They are only left. It is not a wage, and it is not a verdict. It is only the plain accident of which way the ice broke, and that to live small and shut for shame of having lived is the one way to make a dead man's gift come to nothing. For your brother did not put himself under the ice so that you might spend the life he bought you, sitting up in the dark in a chair. And you know it. And he would say it a deal plainer than I dare. The Duke of Ravensmere put his face in his hands in the boathouse in the rain and wept. At last, 2 years late, and the dog got up off the sacking and pushed his big head in under the man's arm and leaned on him. And Thomasin took up the low lantern and went out quietly into the rain and up to the house and left the 2 of them to it, the man and the dog, because there are things a person is owed, and one of them is to grieve without a stranger watching. And she had given him the one thing she had, which was the words, and it was his now to say them or not. Lady Sabine Cardew came down from London on the 11th of April, with a maid, a man, a mountain of boxes, and a way of coming into a room that made the room straighten itself and stand up. She was 26, and she was, past all argument, beautiful, with dark gold hair and a clear gray level gaze and a white throat, and that carriage that cannot be got after the age of 12, and Thomasin understood within a day that she was not a guest, and not a stranger, and not a caller. She had her own rooms. She had had them for years. For Lady Sabine Cardew and the Duke of Ravensmere had been spoken of together since they were children, their 2 houses lying either side of the same long water, and it had been understood in both families and in every drawing room in that part of the county for the better part of 10 years that they would marry, and would have married already, most people thought, if the ice after 12th night 2 winters since had not put the whole house into a mourning it had never once come out of. She had waited. She had been, by every account and by her own quiet, unspoken reckoning, patient and loyal and very good, through 2 years in which the man she was to marry had gone silent and gray and unreachable as the far side of the moon. And she had come down every spring and stayed near and asked nothing and named nothing on the long list of things one did not name in that house, the ice and the island and the boathouse and the young lord and the dog, and she had learned to walk through those cold rooms as carefully as everybody else. And she had earned, she felt, and not wholly without justice, the thing that was coming to her, which was to be the Duchess of Ravensmere by the year's end. And she came down that April and found a parson's orphan at the head of the slip, telling the Duke to keep still and not speak yet. And the Duke keeping still, and the dead brother's dog that no one could go near lying quiet and dry against the girl's knee, and the child that had not gone down the slope in 2 years standing at the water with her hand in the dog's coat, and the whole frozen machine of that house beginning, after 2 years, to turn over and move. And it had not been she who moved it. Lady Sabine was kind to Thomasin. That wants setting down plainly, because she was not a monster, and the truth of her is a sadder thing than a monster. She had Thomasin's name in a day, which was more than Mrs. Trewin had troubled to learn in 2 months. She was honestly glad to see the child come down to the water again, for she had known Bee since the baby was in arms. She saw Thomasin going threadbare at the cuffs and sent up to her, without a word, a length of good dove-gray stuff to be made against the summer. And Thomasin kept the memory of that kindness the rest of her life and never knew what to do with it. And she was clever and not blind, and had loved the man a long, long time, and it took her a fortnight of those green evenings to understand exactly what she was looking at down at the water, and that it had come upon the man without his knowing it, and upon the girl without her wanting it, and that neither had done one thing a court or a bishop could name, and that this, precisely the innocence of it, was what made it not to be borne. For there is no fighting it. A woman may fight a flirtation and win. She cannot fight a parson's daughter standing in the dusk with her hand on a dying dog, telling a broken man that the ones who are left are only left, while he drinks it down like water in a desert. There is nothing to take hold of. And Lady Sabine Cardew, who had done everything right for 10 years and was owed her reward by every rule she was raised inside, watched a girl in a dead man's coat undo 2 years of her waiting in 6 weeks, by the plain means of not being afraid. And something in her that had held still a long time began, very quietly, to stop being able to hold still. She came down to the water herself on the 19th of April, in the evening, in thin-town shoes over the rough, wet grass, which for a woman like her is a labor and a decision, and she stood back from the slip at a careful distance, and said Thomasin's name. And then she said the thing she had come to say, and she said it well, because she was neither a fool nor yet, at that hour, cruel. There is a family, she said, in Bath. Very good people, a physician and his wife and 3 little girls, and they want a gentle woman who is steady and does not chatter, and it is £35 a year and your own parlor with a fire in it and a whole half day on the Sundays. And I have written to them already, and they will take you on my word alone, and you might go at the quarter and be settled in a warm town before ever the winter comes down again. £35 a year. Thomasin stood on the slip with the dog's lead in her hand and did the sum that any woman in her place does at once and cannot help doing, and it was a great sum, more than she would see in 3 years at Ravensmere, a parlor of her own, a fire of her own, the whole difference between a life and a long cold string of other people's back stairs, and it was, she knew perfectly well standing there, also a bribe, and the kindest and most generous bribe she was ever likely in this world to be offered. She said, "May I ask why your ladyship is so very good to me?" And Lady Sabine Cardo, to her lasting credit, did not pretend. She looked at the dog, and she looked at the girl, and she said, "Because I am going to marry him, at last, and I have carried this house on my back for 2 years, every single day of it, and I am not going to be turned out of my own life at the end of it by a governess in a man's coat who came up here in January on a carrier's cart." Thomasin said, "He has asked me for nothing, my lady," and Lady Sabine said, "No, he has not. He does not ask a living soul for anything. He has not asked one thing of any creature since the ice. He stands at the edge of things and waits for other people to go first. It is the whole of his character. And if we all of us wait for that man to speak, we shall every one of us be dead and buried first. Somebody has to live his life for him. I have done it 2 years. You have been here 2 months. And she was, in every particular she named, entirely and terribly correct, and Thomasin knew it, and could not for the life of her find it in herself to hate the woman. She said, "My lady, there is a thing owing here that has nothing to do with his grace and nothing to do with any place in Bath, and it is the dog. There is a day coming when they set the young lord's stone at the water, and I mean to have that dog quiet and off the mere by then, come away from the deep for good, and I will not leave a thing half done that I have got this far. It is not in me, and it is not for love of anybody. It is only that my father taught me you do not walk away from a creature at the edge of the deep. And I gave the dog my word before I understood what else was in this house, and I will keep it." And Lady Sabine looked at her a long, level moment and said, quietly, and with no plan yet in her head, only the first cold shape of one starting to set, "That is not the whole of why you are staying, and we both of us know it is not." And she picked her careful way back up the wet slope in her ruined shoes, and Thomasin watched her go with a feeling like a cloud coming over the sun, and no notion in the world what to do about it. Now there was a thing Thomasin did in those weeks that was as innocent as bread and looked, when it was held up later in a wicked order, as black as pitch, and it wants telling here, in its own plain shape, before anybody set a crooked shape on it. To bring the dog up off the mere at dusk before he had swum himself foundered, she had wanted a thing of his master's, and Caleb had told her there was a whistle, a little ivory dog whistle the young lord had used on the water, that the old Duchess had taken to herself out of the gun-room after the drowning, and kept and turned in her blind fingers by the fire all day long. The small yellow whistle on a cord that Thomasin had seen the very first morning. And Thomasin had knelt by the old lady one afternoon and told her plainly what she wanted it for, to call the dog in off the deep and break him of his waiting, and the old blind Duchess had put the whistle into her hand and closed her own 2 hands over Thomasin's round it and said, "If you can fetch that dog off the water, where my son could whistle till he was black in the face, and not fetch him, then take it, and God go with you. Only bring it me back at night, for I cannot sleep without it in my hand." And so Thomasin had it of the old Duchess freely, and used it at dusk down at the water, and carried it back up to the old lady's room in the dark every night, and put it into the restless hands. And there was nothing in the whole of it that was not clean and open and known to the one person it belonged to, but it meant that a parson's orphan was seen, by whoever cared to watch from an upper window, going down alone to the forbidden water in the falling dark night after night, and coming back up to the house long after, in a man's coat, with a dead man's whistle in her pocket, letting herself in at a side door by a light nobody else carried. And that is a set of true things, every one of them true, and you may see already, held up in the wrong order and the wrong light, exactly the shape they can be made to take. Lady Sabine had been 3 weeks by then wound tighter and tighter, watching the thing at the water ripen in the long evenings, and she had the cold shape of it half built already in her mind, wanting only a nail to hang it on. And the nail came to her the way such nails do, from a careless, honest neighbor who meant no harm on this earth. There was a gentleman, Sir Owen Harcourt, a magistrate and a churchwarden of 40 years' standing, heavy, careful, and much concerned for the good order of the county, who drove over one afternoon to see the Duke on the business of the memorial stone. And going home along the head of the mere in the dusk, he saw the Duke's companion, the little parson's girl, down at the forbidden slip in the near dark with the mad dog, and, standing close beside her, the bent shape of a man, the two of them together at the water where no one was let go, and he thought nothing whatever of it, for it was only old Caleb Stroud helping her with the beast, but he mentioned it that same evening to Lady Sabine Cardew over the tea things at his own table, as one mentions the small nothings of the road, because a man will always tell a beautiful woman the little doings of his day. A girl, the forbidden water, in the dark, a man beside her. It took Lady Sabine about 4 seconds, and here is the thing that must be understood, because without it she is only a villain, and with it a person, which is worse and truer. She did not invent a lie. She was shown a door out of 2 years of holding still, and the door was made, every plank of it, out of true pieces, and she had only to gather up the true things lying about, the girl at the water in the dark, the man beside her, the dead lord's whistle in her pocket, the child taken down the forbidden slope, the Duke gone strange and open after 2 years of stone, and hold them up to the right people in a particular order, and let the county do the rest. And the county was aching to do the rest, for a reason Thomason understood only long after, which was that for 2 years the whole country had stood in a careful ring around a hole in the middle of a sentence, being tactful, and here at last was a thing it was allowed to be angry about aloud, and the relief of it ran through the parish like a thaw. Lady Sabine did not go to the Duke. She went 3 days later to Sir Owen Harcourt's own wife in her own drawing room, and she was very distressed, and said she had not slept for the trouble of it, and did not know where her plain duty lay, and then she said she must tell it or go distracted, that the girl had grown strange and secret, that she went down to the water in the dark alone and would say to no one what she did there, that she had somehow got the young lord's own whistle out of the poor blind duchess, who did not know what she gave, that the child was being taken down to the very edge of the deep, where her father drowned, and here Lady Sabine let her voice drop and her eyes fill. She had begun to fear, she could hardly say it, that the girl had got some hold over his grace in his grief, that there was money in it somewhere, some scheme. For how did a parson's orphan, who came in January with nothing, keep herself in whistles and secret errands, and had not Sir Owen with his own eyes seen the man at the water with her in the dark? And Sir Owen Harcourt's wife carried it to Sir Owen, and Sir Owen, an honest, heavy man, who had indeed seen a man at the water with his own 2 eyes, felt the floor of the thing go solid under him, and it was in the Ravensmere Arms by the following market day, and through both parishes by the Sunday, and it grew as it ran, the way these things grow. until there was a telling in which the girl had bewitched the Duke outright, and a telling in which she had been got with child by the man at the water, and a telling in which she had come to Ravensmere a schemer from the very first, sent up on purpose, and not one of the tellings had in it the plain fact that a blind old woman had freely given a whistle to fetch her dead son's dog off the deep, because that fact was slow, and had too many parts, and would not go in at a blow. They turned on her at the water first. A boy threw a stone that starred the window of the last boathouse. Someone left the slip gate swinging wide in the night, hoping, she thought, the mad dog would get out and drown and settle the whole matter. But the dog only walked down and stood off the island in the dark as he always had, and was there in the gray morning where Caleb found him and led him in. She walked into the village for a paper of pins, and a woman she had never exchanged a word with stepped square across the flags and said, "You ought to be ashamed," and spat on the stones beside her shoe. And a knot of people stopped to watch, and not one was sorry. And Thomasin went home the 2 miles and told nobody. Because there was nobody in that house it was safe to tell. She was called up on the 4th of May, 3 weeks before the memorial. It was the small morning room, and Mrs. Trewin stood by the door with her hands folded, and Sir Owen Harcourt sat square and unhappy with his hat on his knee, and Lady Sabine Cardew sat in the chair by the cold hearth with her hands quiet in her lap, and the Duke of Ravensmere stood at the far window with his back to the whole of the room and his hands locked behind him, looking down the slope at the water. Nobody bid Thomasin sit. Lady Sabine said it beautifully. She was gentle, and she was grieved, and she was so very sorry, she said, and she laid it out piece by true piece, the girl going down to the forbidden water alone in the dark. The man seen there with her by Sir Owen's own eyes, the young lord's whistle got from the poor blind duchess. The strange hold the household could all of them see the girl had got over his grace in his affliction. The money there must somewhere be in it, and she said every word of it in a low, even voice, with true tears standing in her clear gray eyes, and she was believed, because she more than half believed the shape of it herself, which is the way the very best lies are always told. And then she said, and I am so sorry, but somebody must ask it plainly, who was the man at the water? And every head in that room turned to Thomasin Bligh. And Thomasin said, in the flat, plain Level's voice, the man at the water was Caleb Stroud, who has kept the boats on this mere for 60 years, and taught his Grace and his brother both to swim. And he came down of an evening to help me with the dog, because the dog is a great strong beast, and it is dark work on wet stone. And there is your man at the water, and any of you may ask him, and he will tell you the same before God. And she turned to the room and told the whole of it, plainly, in its own slow shape, the dog swimming himself half to death 600 nights, the whistle she had asked of the Duchess to her face and been freely given and carried back to her hands every night, the child come down to the water of her own accord and the better for it, and she told it true and entire. And she watched it land in that room and be too slow, and have too many parts, and ask the 4 people in it to hold still and fit the pieces together, and she saw them not do it. Because a truth in its right shape is a slow and a jointed and a patient thing, and asks a great deal of the hearer, and a lie is a single piece already cut to the shape of a nail, and goes in at one blow. And she had learned that once at her father's knee, and she learned it again standing on a duke's carpet with her whole life coming apart. She turned, at the last, to the straight black back of the man at the window, and she said, only to him, sir, I have never in 3 months said one word about your brother or your grief to any living creature, and I never would, and you know it. You above every soul in this house know it. For you said it to me yourself in a boathouse in the rain, and no third thing heard it but the dog. And the Duke of Ravensmere, who had heard every syllable of it, who knew in the one deep place where a man keeps the few things he is entirely sure of that this girl had never once betrayed him, and never could, who had in the whole of that morning exactly one thing to do, which was to turn round from the window and open his mouth, did not turn round. Because to clear her he would have to speak, and to speak was to say the water, and the ice, and his brother, and the whole of what he had told her in the boathouse, aloud, in a room, to a magistrate. And the moment any of it was said aloud, the county would have from his own mouth the confirmation it was hungry for, that there was a terrible, unspeakable thing about the young lord's death. And the lie would be proven true in its very particulars, in the act of his rising to deny it. And a man who has not said one true word aloud in 2 years does not, at the single moment it would cost him everything to say it, become on the instant a man who can. He stood at the window with his hands locked behind his back and the May light on the water below. And he said nothing at all, and Mrs. Trewin told Thomason in the silence that she would leave in the morning. Now, if you would know how a parson's daughter came up out of that morning room, and how a man who had not said one true thing in 2 years came at the last to stand at the edge of the water in front of the whole of 2 parishes and say the very worst one aloud, then stay by me, for I am nowhere near done with these people. And if this house has got its cold hand on you the way it had its hand on me the whole while I was setting it down, then put your name to us before you go on, for there is a great deal more of Ravensmere than one evening will hold, and I should not like you to be turned away at the door of it in the dark. She was down at the water at 4:30 the next morning, in the dark, dressing a pad the dog had torn on the fence, because she was not going to leave a creature the worse for one night for anything people said of her. And Caleb Stroud came and worked beside her by one low lantern until it came gray light off the mere. And when it was done, the old man stood with his hand on the dog's wet head and said the only thing he ever said to her about the whole of it. He said, I have known since the morning we pulled that dog out, miss. His Grace told me the once, that his brother took his own wrist back a purpose so the ice would carry the one of them. And I have held it 2 year. And if I had gone into that room yesterday and said it, they would have had to hear me. For I taught the both of them the water, and no creature in this county would call me a liar. And I did not go in. I let them put you out, because I have been feared of that man's grief 2 year, the way you are feared of a live thing in the dark, and I am ashamed to the bone. And Thomason said, It was not yours to tell, Caleb. And he said, No, but it wanted telling, and I held my tongue, the same as him, the same as all of us. She left at 8 in the morning on the 5th of May. Mrs. Trewin gave her a shilling that was not owed her, and did not meet her eye. Her box went down the front steps because there was no one to carry it round the yard way, and she stood in the drive under the black limes with the box at her feet in the very spot the carrier had set her down in January. And she was 24, and had a shilling and 3 pounds, and a dead man's coat, and no place in the world, and she had gone, in the plainest reckoning, all the way round the earth in 3 months, and fetched up exactly where she started, only more alone, because in January she had not yet had a single thing to lose. She did not go far. The sexton's widow at Ravensmere Parva took her in for 9 pence a week 2 miles down the vale, and she sat among strangers' graves for 2 weeks and a half, and could not think of one thing to do next. And on the morning of the 23rd of May, which was the day fixed for the setting of the young lord's stone at the head of the mere, she got up and put on her father's coat, and walked the 2 miles back, not to the house, she would not have dared the house, but to the water, because the whole county was going to be there, and one more plain woman at the back of a crowd is nobody, and because she could no more keep away from the end of it than she had been able to keep away from the dog. They had chosen the water for the setting because the family plot in the little church was full, and because the young lord had loved the mere above any ground on the earth, and the mason had cut a plain gray cross to stand at the head of the slip, looking out over the deep, and it stood that morning veiled under a white cloth, with the whole of 2 parishes gathered on the slope behind it in the sun, 300 and 400 souls come to see the Duke of Ravensmere set his brother's stone at last, and to see if they were honest with themselves whether the disgraced companion would have the face to show, and Thomason stood at the very back, up on the terrace wall, in the coat, and waited, and down at the front, held on a short lead by old Caleb Stroud, dry and quiet in the sun, sat the black dog. The rector got as far as the committal, and then Sir Owen Harcourt rose from his place, because he was a churchwarden of 40 years and a magistrate, and he believed, wholly and honestly, that he was doing his plain and painful duty, and he could not stand at the hallowing of that poor lady's brother's stone with the thing unsaid a moment longer. He said, "Forgive me," to the rector, and then set it out to the whole bright slope in a clear country voice, that he could not in conscience see that stone set, while there stood among them the young woman who had wormed into his grace's grief, and got the dead lord's whistle from a blind old lady, and gone down to the water in the dark with a man, and had, he did not doubt, a scheme in it for money, and had brought the whole parish to shame, and 400 faces turned and found Thomason Bligh up on the terrace wall in her father's coat, and it went very quiet, and the rector looked up at her, half in dread and half in pity, and said, "Miss Bligh, will you answer it?" She came down through the crowd because they made a lane for her the way a crowd will, and she came to the front and stood beside the veiled stone at the head of the slip with the bright water behind her, and 400 people in front of her, and she did not cry out that it was false, and that was the thing, for they were all of them braced for the noise of a girl screaming no, and she did not make it. She said, in the flat plain voice she had found in front of no one and everyone, the man at the water was Caleb Stroud, who was stood there now with the dog in his hand, and he came to help me with a great heavy grieving beast on wet stone in the dark, and you may ask him where he stands. The whistle was the young lord's, and I asked it of her grace the Dowager Duchess to her face, and told her plainly it was to call this dog up off the deep, and break him of drowning himself by inches, and she gave it me into my own hand, and closed her 2 hands over mine, and bade me bring it her back each night. And I did, every night. And any woman that has sat with the old lady may ask her. Blind as she is, she will tell you whose whistle it is, and who had it, and why. And I went down to the water in the dark, that is true. I went down every dark night there was. And I will tell you what I did there. I told a dog that his master was dead. She let that stand a moment in the sun. She said, "That is the whole of my great secret and my scheme for money, that I did for a dog the one thing not a soul at this house would do for 2 years. I told him the truth, that the one he waits for is not coming up out of that water, and I told him he was let stop, and let grieve, and let come away, and I would have done the same for any grieving creature on this estate that was let me, the dog, or the child, or the old lady, or the man, for they are every one of them sick of the same thing, and it is not madness, and it is not scheming. It is grief that has been forbidden, and grief that is forbidden does not lie quiet where you bury it. It comes up in the night and goes and lives in something else, And if you want to see where the grief of this house has gone to live these 2 years, look no further than that dog, who has carried every ounce of it none of you would pick up. And that is when the Duke of Ravensmere came down through the crowd. He came out from the front of the gathering where he had stood by the veiled stone, and 400 people drew back from him with a sound like a wave going off shingle, and he was 32 years old and had not said a sentence of any weight to a living soul in 2 years. And when his voice came, it was so low that the men at the back leaned in and held their breath to catch it. He said, "My brother's name was Christopher." He said it, and the whole slope flinched as if he had fired a gun over the water. He said, "We called him Kit, and he was 24, and he is not away, and he is not the poor young lord, and he is not a hole in the middle of your sentences. He is dead. He is drowned. He is in that water behind me where he has been 2 winters. And I have not said his name aloud in all that time, and I have not suffered one of you to say it either. And I begin by begging the pardon of every servant who has cleaned his boots and oiled his guns and laid his hat out on the gallery, for that was not my love keeping his memory, that was my grief made into a law and hung round your necks to carry." He stopped, and no one so much as breathed. He said, "Sir Owen would know was there some terrible, unspeakable thing about my brother's death. And there was, and I will say it myself now, and then it can never again be held over this girl or any other soul." We were out on the ice together after 12th night, in the dark, as we had gone since boys, and it broke, and he went in, and I had his wrist in my 2 hands and would have had him out, and he felt what I felt, that the ice would carry one of us and not the pair. And he took his wrist back out of my hands, of his own will, and put himself down under the black on purpose, to take his weight off the ice so that mine would bear. And I lived, and he chose that I should. And that is the thing I could not say, for there is no way to say I am alive, because my brother did the sum faster than I could, and stand up in the daylight and be the Duke. And I have spent 2 years making this whole house as silent and as drowned as he is sooner than say it, and this girl, who never told one word of what she had of me in confidence, has been broken before you all for a truth she never spoke. And I will not have it, and so I have spoken it myself, and it is done." And there was a silence over that bright water, of a kind the people standing in it were still telling their grandchildren of 50 years on. And then Lady Sabine Cardew came forward out of the crowd, white to the lips, and stood up in the sun in front of 400 people, and said, she never said any of it. Not one word. I took true things and set them in a wicked order and carried them to Sir Owen's house myself. Because this girl came here in January with nothing, and undid in 6 weeks a thing I had waited 10 years for, and I could not fight it. For there was nothing in it to take hold of. She only was not afraid of him, and I have been afraid of him, and afraid for him, and afraid of losing him every day for 2 years. And I made a lie out of true pieces because I could not bear it, and it is mine, the whole of it. And then she looked at the Duke and said the thing that made a good many people on that slope come in time to forgive her, which was, "And you never once said no to me, either. In 10 years, not once, I would have taken a no years ago and gone and had a life of my own. But you let me wait at your gate the same as you have made every creature here wait at yours. And I am done waiting now, and I wish you well, and I am ashamed, and I am going." And she walked back up through the lane in the crowd and out at the top of the slope alone, and no one stopped her, and that was the last morning she was ever seen in that parish. And it was into the silence after the old man sat that a small, clear voice came up from down near the front, from where a very small girl in black stood with her hand wound into the black dog's coat, a voice not one soul in that county had heard raised in 2 years, and it said one word, and the word was Papa. Little Bee had spoken. She had come down to the water with the household, and she had heard her uncle say her father's name aloud into the sun for the first time in her memory. And the door in her that had been shut since the ice had come open the way Thomason's father had always said such doors come open, sideways, when the safe thing at last is done. And she said Papa, once into the hush of 400 people. And then she let go of the dog's coat and walked up the lane in the crowd, small and steady, past her uncle, all the way up to the terrace wall, to Thomason, and put up her arms, and Thomason lifted her, and the child put her face into Thomason's neck and said, into her collar, so that only Thomason heard it, tell the dog. So they told the dog. The whole gathering came down the slope to the water in the May morning, nobody ordering it, the rector in his surplice, and Sir Owen with his hat crushed in his hands, and Mrs. Trewin weeping without shame, and the old Duchess led down on a manservant's arm, with the empty whistle cord in her fingers. And the Duke of Ravensmere took the lead from Caleb Stroud's hand, and walked the black dog down onto the pale stones of the slip to the very edge of the deep, and he knelt down there on the wet stone in his morning coat in front of the whole county. And he put his hand flat on the great black shoulder on the running engine place, though his brother had shown him, and not this girl. And he took the little ivory whistle that Thomason put into his other hand, and he did not blow it. He set it down. He put his mouth to the wet black ear instead and said, so that only the nearest heard it, and the rest read it off the shaking of his shoulders. His name was Kit, and he is dead, and he is not coming up, old friend, and you carried him long enough, longer than any of us, and you are let stop now and come away home. And the black dog stood at the very lip of the water where he had gone in 600 dusks, and he looked out once across the bright deep at the little island with the 3 bent alders, and then he turned his head away from it, into the man's chest, and let out a breath, a long, uneven, shuddering sigh of a breath, the setting down of a weight carried alone too long, the same breath he had given Thomason at her knee in the frost in January, and he did not go into the water, and he never, from that morning to the good old age at which he died by a fire, went down to that slip at dusk again. The dog came away up the slope to heel between the man and the child, and there was not a dry face on the whole of that sunlit shore. What the Duke did with his brother's memory, when the shock of that morning had settled into the ordinary running of his days, he did quietly, and without his name on it. He had a proper boat built, and kept manned at the head of the mere, and a bell hung in the boathouse and the ice rope mended, so that no soul should ever again go down in that water in the dark unheard and unhelped the way his brother had, and the first families he saw righted by it were fishermen's and ferrymen's, who never knew whose grief had bought them their safety. Lady Sabine Cardew left the county that summer and married, the spring following, a member of Parliament for a borough in the West, and she and Thomason never met again nor wrote. But when the first Ravensmere child was born there, came a parcel from the West with no letter in it, only a length of good dove-gray stuff made up at last into a shawl, and Thomason wore it 2 winters and thought of the woman every time, and could never once bring herself to think ill of her. They were married in the little church at the foot of the park on a morning in June, and she brought to it a shilling and 3 pounds and a dead man's coat and a book of her father's sermons, and the whole county came, because the whole county was not going to be kept away from it, and the small girl walked in front of her, strewing the path and talking the entire way, and the black dog walked at the Duke's heel through the light gate as grave as a churchwarden. There is one thing more, and then I will let you go. On the river gallery there is a locked door, and behind it the young lord's rooms exactly as he left them, and the Duke could not for a long while go in, until one evening in the second winter he put the key into Thomason's hand and said, "I cannot yet, but you may, if you think it right, and open the window, for a room a man has drowned out of want's air." And she opened it, and aired it, and found on the desk a letter the young lord had been writing the very week he died, unfinished, to a friend gone for a soldier, and the last line he had set down before he put his pen by and went out onto the ice was, "I mean to spend my whole life on this water. There is nowhere on the earth I would rather be." And she gave it to the Duke, and he read it, and for the first time it did not undo him, and he had it framed and hung by the water door, because it was true, and there was no longer any reason on the earth it could not be said. So, here is where I leave you, on a bright green slope, above a still water, with 400 people weeping in the sun, and a black dog come away at last from the edge of the deep. I have thought all week about old Caleb Stroud, who kept the whole of the truth in his chest 2 years because he was frightened of a man that never once raised his voice, and about the 2 ways there are of carrying a thing too heavy to say. You can do as the Duke did, and lay it silently on the shoulders of everyone who loves you, and call the weight of it respect. Or you can be the one who walks down to the water at the last and kneels and says the true name out loud. Tell me, before you sleep tonight, which of the 2 you have been. And if there is somebody in your own life who is still, officially, only away, you might think this week on the difference. Next time I mean to tell you what became of the child, and of the soldier the letter was written to, who came home. And if you have come all this way down to the water with us, put in the comments below which city you are watching from, for I read every one, and it never ceases to astonish me how far the sound of it carries.